Thank you. First of all, thank you for being here. First of all, also sorry for my absence lately to this forum. I think I have an excuse. I was actually doing this. I'm in the process of completing my dissertation, so I should be finished in about 2 weeks. So that's also the reason why I'm going to just use this forum as a trial for the public defense, really. It's a bit more, it's a bit longer actually, but just to give you an idea of what I've been doing the past 4.5 years since I've started my dissertation. Actually, some of you might know what I'm doing, others probably don't. I started it in 2009, doing a research or a PhD on the history of education during the Second World War in Belgium, and you might actually wonder as to why or how I actually came to that subject. And it was very much inspired by some articles that I read in newspapers that were published right after the war. For instance, in 1945, right after the liberation of Belgium, the francophone Catholic newspaper, La Libre Belgique, published an article in which was stated that Belgian children had been subjected to a process or a German program of indoctrination during the war. And the same thing was actually picked up by international newspapers. In May 1945, for instance, 2 British newspapers, the News Chronicle and the Daily Telegraph, they also talked about this indoctrination program during the war and how children had been a victim of that. And they actually said, well, what you need now is a purge. So you need to kind of remove all the National Socialist elements out of your educational system. Very interestingly, I think, is that the Minister of Education, the British Minister of Education at the time, Butler, he argued at the opening ceremony of the Bourbon College as well that Belgian children had been victims of a unilateral procedure of misinformation. That's actually quite a literal quote, or an explicit quote I got from his speech. So to me that kind of formed a source of inspiration, because I think these newspaper articles clearly illustrate that right after the war, the position of teachers and also how the German occupier allegedly implemented an educational program, or their own National Socialist educational program in Belgian schools was fiercely debated. But what you see is that the debates kind of moved to the background very, very soon. And as a result, at the moment, there is not really a lot of work that has been done, a lot of academic research has been done on the actual development of the educational during the wars. The war is usually portrayed as kind of a vacuum, like the history of education of Belgium. It stops in 1940 and it picks up again in 1945. So World War II kind of formed the Dark Ages in that respect. So that's basically just to give you an idea as to how I came to the subject. And it was particularly that paradox that kind of set me thinking about what possible research questions I could address in my dissertation. And generally, my dissertation revolves around 4 central research questions. First of all, I think the question soon arose to me if the British Minister of Public Education actually was right in his argument that there was such a thing as an indoctrination program during the war. So I was very curious to know what was the educational policy of the so-called German military government that occupied Belgium between 1940 and 1944. And I was very curious to know as well if the education or the educational system or schools really did serve as kind of a political tool in the hands of the National Socialist regime to bring about acceptance of the government and of National Socialism. Belgium is a very interesting case, I think, in that respect, because we have a very particular structure of education, in the sense that we have an official network that is run by the state, and we also have a very strong tradition of Catholic schools, so private schooling, and in practice in Belgium those are mostly Catholic schools that fall under the responsibility of the Roman Catholic Church and also its congregations. So I was very curious to know, how did they respond to this new situation, because obviously their authority over education was questioned, or was at least put under a lot of pressure. From the very onset of my research, it was my intention not to limit myself to the level of political decision making, because that is what happens a lot in histories of education. They just kind of restrict themselves to researching what happened at the level of administration, organization, and structure of schooling. And what I also wanted to do was to really explore the developments within what they call school culture. I will come back to that. We'll pick up on that concept in a few slides. So how did school culture, so daily life in schools really, develop during the war, and what were the experience? How did teachers and pupils and principals and parents and so on, how did they actually experience their time in school during the Second World War? So basically what I wanted to do is also research the very subjective experiences of actors at the lower levels of the educational pyramid, we could argue. Related to that is, if you look at how histories of the Second World War, you see that the category of memory is actually taking an increasingly important place within history of the Second World War. So I kind of felt as if I couldn't really do a study about the Second World War and not touch the concept of memory. So that's why in fourth place I also wanted to look at how teachers and pupils and principals and so on did not only experience but also remember. So remember after the war, what is their recollection of their time in schools during the war. And obviously, I mean, pupils and teachers as a category in memory studies is, it's a neglected category, I could say. But if you look at, I mean, obviously there was a vast amount of literature on, general literature on the landscape of memory, of war memories in Belgium. And what I also wanted to know is whether the patterns because I should rephrase this, because in order to investigate this, I have made use of both written material and also oral interviews. And I have a huge amount of questionnaires, because there was a lot of research conducted into the documentation of the memories of pupils and teachers, particularly between the 1980s and the 1990s in Belgium. And I could use that material, so I haven't really sent out the questionnaires myself. I could just consult them in the archives. I have about 700 questionnaires, which is a huge amount. And obviously that enables me to kind of not only look at very specific memories of the war, so of different pupils and of different teachers, but also see whether there are any patterns in their memories, and whether these patterns in pupil and teacher memory actually coincide or sometimes conflict with general patterns of war memories in Belgian society. So I hope that was clear. Although within the history of education, the history of wartime schooling or schooling during the war is a bit under-investigated, you could argue. Obviously there's a huge amount of studies on the history of the Second World War in Belgium, And obviously I want to contribute something to the history of education, but also to something to the history of the Second World War. So I felt as if I had to add something or do something new, because there's already so much work. And when or research on that topic, and when I started reading, obviously I started reading a lot of histories of the Second World War in Belgium at the very start of my research, and it kind of struck me that especially the older literature kind of puts forward the idea of a unilateral imposition of the occupation on Belgian society. So in 1940 we're occupied by the Germans, and they imposed their ordinances and their rules and their fascist policy or national socialist policies on Belgian societies, and the position of societal actors, that can be those can be institutions, but also people, just the ordinary people. Their position towards the occupation is usually explained in terms of collaboration or resistance, or something in between, which we call accommodation, so adapting to the situation. So basically societal actors, or the implication is that societal actors actually have very limited choices to respond to such a new situation. That is particularly visible when you look at literature on the Roman Catholic Church, because maybe I should have mentioned that, but I specifically look at the development of private schools, so Catholic schools during the war, so I'm mostly concerned with how the Catholic Church and the congregations responded to the war. If you look at the literature on the position of the Catholic Church during the Second World War, you have basically two stances. So basically they're researchers arguing, well, or trying to prove the complicity of the Catholic Church in the proliferation or spread of National Socialism in Europe. On the other hand, you also have a branch of scholarship portraying the church as a victim of Nazi persecution. So again, you have these two, you have collaboration and resistance again. The same kind of goes for the literature on the category of war children. This category or concept has been specifically developed in German historiography. And if you look at how children are portrayed in the context of the history of the Second World War, although there are some exceptions, but they're usually portrayed as the child is the innocent victim who kind of, or the innocent child that falls victim to a war, which is basically, between a war between adults, basically. So, I mean, you do have a few exceptions on that. For instance, you have literature on children in the Hitler movement and all that, but generally, the same also goes for the literature on education during the war, which mainly focuses on the very restrictive policy or elements of the restrictive policy of National Socialism or the German occupier in the occupied countries, and also the negative influences the war had on the development of schooling. So you had children or schools as victims of bombardments, and schools as victims of food shortages and all that. So basically, you have collaboration and resistance, or the perpetrator versus the victim. That is basically the dualism that you find in historiography. I tried to add something to that dualism by, how should I explain this? So rather than looking at the relation between the occupier and the occupied society as a very static relationship, so the occupier imposes something on the occupied society and then it responds, I try to look at things from a more dynamic perspective, and mostly that of negotiation. So more specifically, I look at the ways in which the military government didn't really impose something impacting on society, but how was that, how did they, how was the future of the Belgian educational system, I should say it like this, how was the future of the Belgian educational system negotiated between different actors on the level of political decision making, and also how did actors at the very basis of the educational pyramid, how did they negotiate their position within the school and within the larger society? Because what you see, if you look at sources of school archives, you see that, I mean, the position of schools could vary. I mean, there's a huge variation in how pupils and teachers and also schools positioned themselves or taught about the political regime, or so basically, how can you explain for that heterogeneity? I hope I make myself clear anyway. If it's not clear, just ask, obviously. It'll maybe become somewhat clearer in the following slides. One of the implications of the proposed approach, so by looking at dynamic interactions between several actors on several levels, is that I have to shift from structures to actors. So basically, the problem I see with structuralist historiography is that it starts from the very deterministic idea of the fact that, or the idea that people's lives are only determined by what happens on the level of the structure. So basically, that is, I think, one issue. I start from the idea that structures are important, but we shouldn't overestimate them. And what I want to do is to focus on actors and how their networks or their connections, how that actually works, how that actually function. Because, as I said, the idea of heterogeneity, of a variety of possibilities, how you could adapt to the situation or position yourself, that constituted the very essence of school culture during the war. So I have to explain, how can you explain this? If everyone is kind of determined by the structure, how can you explain for changes and variations? So that was my problem. And in order to explore the actors and their different networks, well, the name kind of says it, I drew inspiration from Bruno Latour's actor network theory. I'm definitely not a specialist on Bruno Latour, but the way I try to use his theory, if I can call it a theory really, it's not my intention to really try to apply his theory to my subject. I don't really think that's possible, or I think it's the possibilities of that are very limited. What I wanted to do is to use Ant as kind of a conceptual toolbox, because if you read Latour and some of the concepts that he puts forward, like his focus on actors' agency, or network, or the networks between actors, or and also the fact that he endorses the merits of a descriptive approach, actually that made me aware of certain things. I could, maybe that's the best way to explain it. So the way I think Ant as a conceptual tool can help me in refining the current history of education, also the historiography of the Second World War. First of all, because he distinguishes, he makes a distinction between intermediaries and mediators. So basically, the intermediaries are like an internet network, so they kind of transport information from point A to point B without really adding anything or like transforming anything. In contrast, mediators do, so they add something. And I think that that difference, although it's not really visible, I I mean, I can't really make a distinction in my history between intermediaries and mediators, because I think they all transform something. But I think that kind of made me aware of the transformative role actors can play in this history, and it kind of led me away, or it just kind of drew my attention away from the structures towards the actors. So that's basically it. Also, he doesn't merely focus or proposes to focus on relations between actors, but on their connectedness. So basically how they mutually influence each other and so on and so forth. And I think that enables me in better understanding the sometimes ambiguous interactions between some of the actors in my story. I already said it in one of the first slides, is that it's explicitly my intention not to limit myself to just a story of political decision making and how the rules were implemented and how the German occupier actually planned on implementing or indoctrinating children or whatever. It was also my intention to really approach the subject from below, just to really see what kind of developments, to investigate developments on the level of school culture. School culture is taking an increasingly important place, I think, within the new cultural history of education. It's very popular, but in contrast to its popularity, I think it's still vaguely defined. Basically, it can mean everything that happens in a school. But it relates to the concept of culture, obviously, which is devoted to the making of meaning. So basically, school culture is all the activities that take place in a school, and also the meanings and the symbols and the particular language that is produced in that particular sphere. I think that histories of school culture as it is, they usually start from the idea of standard didactical and pedagogical practices and very fixed patterns of behavior. So basically they look at what is unique to a school. So they question what makes a school a school. So if you enter the school, you immediately notice, well, this is a school because of the school desk, the playground, and the particular architecture, and so on and so forth. So you really look into those materialities and mentalities that are particular or unique to the school. I think that perspective kind of poses that mere focus kind of poses some problems, because all these studies start from the idea of continuity. So basically, we are talking about fixed patterns of behavior that are fixed, or pedagogical practices that have just been established within a school, and also the autonomy of the school. So the school is often portrayed as a pedagogical island, and Antonio Vignali, he's actually a historian of education who has already criticized this position, and he said, well, how can we, starting from this definition of school culture, how can we look for change? Because, I mean, changes do occur in school culture, and how do you, if you start from the idea of autonomy and continuity, how do you look at change, and also how do you look at the ways in which the school is actually influenced by spheres that are, or elements that are not unique to the school? As a solution, he proposed, well, instead of talking about school culture, we should talk about school cultures in the plural form. I think, I mean, his work obviously is a great matter, but I'm not sure whether his solution, or whether his proposition really is a solution, because does it really, talking about school cultures, does it really allow us to consider the context outside of the school? Or I think it can raise awareness about the fact that change can occur in the school culture, but does it really explain as to why change occurs? I don't think so. So therefore, in my dissertation, I propose not only to look at school culture as linguistically plural, so school cultures instead of school culture, but also consider the concept of school culture as conceptually plural. So basically, the one particular sphere which coincides or conflicts or overlaps with other spheres, such as the economic sphere or the political sphere, to come to, or to apply this to my, as to how I apply this to my research, I think that, or the way I see it in my, or the way I deal with my subject is that Catholic school culture during the war, in my view, is not only determined by the rules and the fixed patterns of behavior, which are very specific or unique to the Catholic educational project, but I also consider those, I don't only look for things that are unique to that educational project, but also look at those things that are completely foreign to it. Yeah, I just try to see the development of school culture during the war as an encounter of different school cultures. So you have the Belgian one and the German one, and also to see how different spheres, and more specifically in my case, the school sphere with the political and institutional sphere, how that actually coincides or conflicts. Just to wrap this up, I'm going to skip about 300 pages of my research, just not to bore you to death or anything, because I mean the chapters in my dissertation kind of coincide with the main research questions I listed on one of the first slides. So I have a chapter on the German educational program, what the aims were and the goals were and all. And the second chapter is more about how negotiations with pre-war educational authorities pass off. The third chapter is more about school culture and how teachers and pupils experienced it, the war, and how that is actually visible in school exercise books, diaries, and all that. And the last chapter is about memory. Just to kind of just give you a couple of research results. In my conclusion, I wanted to pick up on the things that I said, or that I started with. So I started with the conclusions of the journalists of several newspapers, and also the British Minister of Public Education, who all argued, well, the Belgian educational system was a victim of German indoctrination, and now we have to get rid of that. So the question, the big question is, was secondary education during the war really a victim of the unilateral procedure of misinformation, as Butler said it? First of all, as I said, I looked at the aims of the educational policy of the German occupier, and they all boil down to a unification, what I call a unification of the social center field. So basically what they wanted to do is, in German there's a term to gleichschalten, or to unify everything, so they wanted to get rid of the opposition between official and state schools, and they just wanted one curriculum, one textbook, which they could control, obviously. That soon conflicted with the ideas of the pre-war educational authorities, who still had a lot of responsibility over the educational network. Their position during the war cannot, I think, be understood in terms of collaboration or resistance, But if you approach the subject from the perspective of negotiation, you see that, well, negotiations between the pre-war educational authorities and the German educational authorities passed or took off during the war, which I understand as a maximalization of interests. So basically what the German occupier wanted was total control over education, whereas the Catholic Church in specific wanted to maintain episcopal control over its schools. On the level of the classroom, you could argue that the intention was to create a neutral school culture. So the idea was to have no politics in the classroom. That was basically it. And it served multiple goals, the neutrality of school culture. And one was to, this was actually an argument or a tool to preserve the order and peace in schools, because schools were such a melting pot of different ideas and conceptions about the war, or ideas about the war or the political situation, that and the creation of a neutral school culture actually enabled to preserve the order and peace in schools and actually continue the educational project as good as possible. I did find that there was a change as a result of the war in school culture, and interestingly, I don't really think that it was ever imposed on schools by the German occupier. But if change occurred on the local level in the classroom, it was because it was instigated from below. So I think that we have to nuance the idea of schools, teachers, pupils, and even the Catholic Church as a victim of the war. But I think that, or what I try to argue for in my dissertation, is that they were full-blown actors in the war. I'm well aware of the fact that if you haven't really read or haven't seen the material, this might actually be very difficult to follow. So in that sense, I can recommend the book. But I'm happy to answer your questions, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Just an informative question. Could you give some examples of this negotiations that you are talking about between these different actors?
Sure. On the level of policy making, you had actually negotiations between the Roman Catholic Church and the military occupier, because at one point the military occupier actually, or the educational policy of the military occupier particularly targeted private schools because they were less easy to control. So at one point in 1942, they published a number of ordinances particularly targeting or restricting the authority of the episcopacy over Catholic schools, because they wanted to draw private schooling out of the influence sphere of the episcopacy or the congregations, and kind of wanted to draw that towards them. And then at first, it's very interesting to see, at first the Catholic Church tried to circumvent the measures, but they were increasingly restricted. And at one point they had to change their strategies because circumvention or resistance was no longer possible if they wanted to maintain their control over schools. And then they entered into negotiations with the culture department of the military government in order to mitigate the restrictions. Yeah, so that was.
Can you give examples of this kind of restrictions? So if they say about, so in the beginning you were talking about this indoctrination, and so I easily imagine that in terms of content or of curriculum content or whatever. Is that the case? So what was the content of these negotiations? What was it about? Was it about who is appointing teachers? Is it about the content, the curriculum? What was the negotiation about?
The negotiation actually was it was a violation of the liberty liberty of education, which is in Belgium constitutionally anchored in Article 17 of our Belgian constitution. So the establishment of schools was no longer free. So in order to establish a new school or to expand an existing school, an existing private school, you had to receive the approbation or the approval of the military government, which is a violation of the Belgian constitution. And that was actually the first step in trying to gain control over private education. Because, I mean, obviously the military government had very clear conceptions about where they were going. They wanted to create one general textbook, or they had they also revised school manuals. So basically, a commission was established to purge all the anti-German passages in books. But the problem that they faced was that they could only implement those rules in official schools because they had no authority whatsoever over private schools. And actually, those the ordinances I mentioned were actually the first step in trying to gain control over the private network in order to, after that, also implement their outlooks in private schools. So, is that clear? Yeah.
It was a more practical question because you said that the history of education during the war was a black box, more or less. How come you got 700 questionnaires on teachers?
It's rough material.
Maybe you said it and I just didn't listen.
No, the questionnaires actually are rough material.
Okay,
so a couple of instances, which was the Center for the History of World War II, so Study and Documentation Center, and also the Confederation of Former Pupils of Private Schools. They organized questionnaires in order to document and collect the memories of pupils who were in schools during the war, and pupils and teachers, they all filled in these questionnaires, but nothing ever happened with those questionnaires. So there is just rough material that has been sitting there in the archive.
Yes.
If I understood you correctly, one of the points you want to make is that in the traditional historiography, people in school during the Second World War were seen as passive victims and so on, and you want to show that they actually had agency and so on. But why do you use the actor network theory to make that point? Because I would say that actor network theory is precisely a methodology that, in a sense, narrows down human agency. It tries to show that what we do as humans is connected to a whole network, which also comprises of things, materiality and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And they're related to this. How do you define actor? Because in your what you told us, actor is always a human being.
Yeah.
Can it also be non-human?
Yeah. I actually forgot to mention that. Yeah, so actors can be just person or like historical persons or personalities, but also events. Because I think that one of the main things I got from Ant was I think that the distinction between the mediator and the intermediary, it just kind of set me thinking about the transformative role that actors have to play, that actors actually play in history. I don't want to get rid of the idea of structure as a whole, but it just raised my awareness about that, and also, I mean, but you're right. I should have said that events obviously also. I mean, events also play a transformative role in my history. So they're not only people, but also.
Yeah, but events are still, I would say, actions of concrete people.
Yeah.
What Latour points out is that it's not only people and events that count, but also very concrete material things, and especially technologies and technological tools and things like that. So it's not only I do something, but technology made me do something. Also,
Yeah.
it widens my possibilities, it narrows down my possibilities.
Yeah.
Is there also room in your account for these material?
Not really, no.
No.
I have to-
So you, and since you define actor in a very
In
classical
very
way,
s-
then
yeah, classical way, yeah.
okay.
Yeah. But would you say that it's incompatible then with
I'm
my
also
idea?
not specialized in actor network theory. Perhaps Matthias can correct me, but I thought that this was.
I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that it's strange to combine a structuralist approach with an actor network approach.
Yeah, well, I don't wish to combine it. I just want to get, like, kind of move away from the structuralist approach.
But
To-
you're saying a couple of times that you don't want to deny the notion of structure,
Well,
but
I don't, because it
actor network theory does.
denies it, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that...
Or yeah, let me maybe rephrase it, maybe not that the notion of structure as such, but the structure is always a result of a network that is holding particular actors, material as well as human into place,
Yeah.
and which stabilizes into something that in retrospect can be considered to be something as a structure. No.
Yeah, but that's also basic. That's also what I do, because I look at, for instance, the actors of the military government and how they actually make the structure. But I do agree that maybe the perspective of the materials or the tools is not really there. I have to.
I think maybe that's also a difficulty with doing historic research
Yeah.
in an actor network thing, because you have these questionnaires. But I'm pretty sure these questionnaires won't ask which materials were or something
No,
like that. So
no.
how did you analyze these things?
So they were structured according. They all had an equal structure. So there's 700 times the same question. So I just analyzed the answers of
But how
the
did you do that? Content-wise or
content-wise, yeah. Content-wise, yeah. And I just looked at patterns and whether these patterns actually coincided with general patterns that are established by historical literature on the landscape of memory in Belgium, because that, yeah.
Can you maybe go back to the previous slide?
Yes. That one?
Yeah, that one. I think, but I'm sure it's because you were very concise and short, but isn't there some kind of circular reasoning here? Because you start from the AMT approach, which states that you have to look at the agency of things and then consider actors to be active and as doing things.
Mm-hmm.
You do that, and then your conclusion is that actors were
Actors,
active.
yeah.
So that's
Yeah,
kind,
yeah.
Of, kind of strange loop you're making there.
Yeah.
Can
That's
you maybe
right.
elaborate on that point?
No, basically I used "and" to kind of, as I said, because it kind of raises your awareness about. No, I actually don't. Elaborate on that. No, but it's you have a good point. Yeah, you have a good point there. Yeah. So it's a circular reasoning, really. That.
Yeah, then maybe you should, but I'm not sure whether that is correct or not, that you should say that you don't use it as an analytical framework.
No,
Just
as a just some concept or like a general framework. It's not really methodology, really, because I think it's quite dangerous to try to apply something or like and on the history of education during the Second World War, because if you would ask me, could you identify mediators and intermediaries in your story, I would have no idea, because everybody always plays a transformative role. But the fact that he makes that distinction kind of sets you thinking and kind of leads you to a particular focus, and that's also why I come to that conclusion, I guess. But you're right, that it's in many ways circular, yeah.
No, but it's interesting to see, because the theory as such states that you, or the methodology of the theory, or whatever you have to call that, state that you always have to go in medias res, so to speak, and to actually be there and observe.
Yeah.
And to contrast it with this analysis of these surveys and other documents.
Yeah.
It makes kind of a nice distinction between these two and how to approach it from an analytical way versus from a conceptual way, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
I had a question about what happened after the Second World War, actually, and how the events during the Second World War might have influenced the image that we had of the child.
Of the child?
Yeah, the child in general, or education. I'm intrigued by what happened during the war, but I also would be very interested in how it impacted on what came after.
Yeah. I actually wrote a very small epilogue to in which I do address that question a little bit, but obviously it's such a vast amount of work that I haven't really done a lot of work on the post-war. What I've basically addressed in my epilogue was, first of all, the purification campaigns of after the war. Obviously the question was raised, now we have to rebuild democratic Europe on our fascist ruins, and how do we do that? By just trying to remove the National Socialist elements of our education. So a lot of importance was attached to civic education. So we had the civic education debate, education for democratic citizenship, that was very popular right after the war, and also the what we call the epuratie, the purge of pro-German teachers and pro-German pupils in schools that had to be punished by the Belgian state. I think that what is interesting, I haven't really done a lot of work on that, but what you see is that after the war, the educational reforms become very important. I mean, obviously educational reforms were already discussed before the war, but kind of the war forms a kind of a catalyst in the reform debates. And what is interesting there is that you see that the memory of the war plays a very important role, especially for the Roman Catholic Church, who wasn't really averse to the post-war reforms, but wasn't really in favor of it either. And they kind of used the memory of the war just to kind of maintain the status quo. Yeah, I would have to have a long debate on. Yeah, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the subject or what the discussions were about, but yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, it's okay. And the second question which I had was where you place the truth in your historical approach. I mean, at a certain point in your presentation, you said that actually one of your aims was to refine the current historiography. And so I deduce from that you stay within the contemporary historiography, and the fact that in a way you want to represent what happened in the past. And I'm just wondering, if that actually was your main intention, to see what really happened in that period between 1940 and 1944. Because you could say that, okay, for the moment we can refine the current methodologies within the history of education, or we can reach with the ones that exist for the moment and try to see whether another approach of history and writing histories would be possible. I would be inclined to try the second pathway, but
yeah, I'm not sure if I can really live up to that claim to really just move away entirely from historiography, because I mean it is very meritful, or I mean it has many merits obviously, but I think that what I try to do, obviously there is no such thing as historical truth with capital T. I think we all know that or believe that, definitely. What I tried to do is to add something new, by approaching the subject from a different angle and giving a different interpretation. I'm not saying that this contributes to historical truth, it just, hopefully, it sets people thinking and maybe consider other perspectives or ways of dealing with this particular history. Is that an answer to your question?
Can I rephrase it like that? But actually, something happened in the past that was the truth. We cannot reach it anymore, but we can try to come as close as possible by refining current methodologies or current historiographical approaches. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, there's no way to know whether we are coming closer or not. We're always. What I did is with the sources that I had at my disposal in what they call inference to the best explanation. In my view, I'm not saying that this represents the truth, but to me, when I confront the sources and I.
But if you say, okay, if we represent pupils as victims, that is more untrue than representing them as actors. That is actually what you're trying to do.
I'm trying to nuance the image of, because it's because it's all over the place, really. Because if you would look at children in the context of the history of war, then they're usually portrayed as victims, and I think we should nuance that. I'm not saying that it's completely untrue, because children were victims in a way. They were victims of bombardments like other people were, but I think there's also another way of looking at their position or looking at their agency. Yeah, is that more or less?
But yeah, I still would be inclined to say that, well, the nuanced way of looking at the picture is more true than the more unilateral point of view, saying that pupils are victims and that's it.
But the point is, how do we know what is true and not true? I mean, that is the great difficulty, right? So you're touching on a very difficult issue, because I mean, we're dealing as historians of education with evaporated past events, and we're not like we can't make observations or anything. So what is the truth, and is there? I mean, I think that given the that's probably not right. If I could, I would argue that.
But I have the impression that today, still, we as historians of education, we try to relate ourselves to a truth that lies in the past. Whereas I hope that something is possible, namely to write histories that relate not with the truth that lies in the past, but with some truth that is ahead of us.
That lies in the future or in the present.
That by means of writing, by means of the histories that you write, that you create space for a truth that still has to come. Does that make sense? Oh.
Yeah, it does make sense, but I'm just not. I just don't know how I would have to do that. I guess because I mean you are right. I do start from the idea that I'm relating on something, a truth that is behind this. And it's not so much my intention to write the history of the school during the war, but I mean, how would I have to do it differently? I don't know. I mean, how would I have to write something for the future? I don't know really, because in your view, how does history differ from fiction?
I don't think it differs.
It differs. Well,
No.
if it doesn't differ, I'm quite frustrated because I would have had to go to all these archives and look at all these sources. So I think that history differs from fiction. I think it does. So
No.
Can you explain why?
Because
You would agree?
yeah, you seem to fully believe what you just said. I mean, you said it with passion, so.
Yeah, so it
Yeah.
nice to hear
I-
why.
Well, there is a quote from Michel Foucault where he has a particular kind of definition of what fiction is. Well, he says that he was reproached of having written a fictional book, and that had to do with the history of madness that he wrote. And he said, okay, everything we write actually is fiction. And saying that it is not is something very, very strange, because for him fiction was showing that many of the things that surround us have become so self-evident that we stopped seeing them, stopped paying attention to them. And the histories he wrote, the fictions that he wrote, were means to make people aware of those things that surrounded them, but which they did not see anymore. And in that way he said, okay, my history is all fiction. They show something that we kind of forgot. That we
So if I get it right, doing something different is fiction, or like approaching something from a completely different perspective, methodology, or whatever is fiction, or
well,
does he mean everything is true?
He
Every
makes it-
interpretation anyone could make about this particular any history is true. Or-
what he wanted to do is to make a difference between, on one hand, a definition of fiction where one says, okay, fiction is showing something that before was invisible, that's hidden, and we reveal it by means of words, by means of language, by means of the language that we use. He says, okay, for me that is not fiction actually. Fiction is showing something that we actually can't see, but that we do not perceive anymore, because it has become so self-evident, which for him was something different, and implied a different relationship with truth. Because in the first instance, revealing the invisibility of something.
It implies that you want to reveal the truth.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if, I mean, I get the distinction, but I'm not sure whether we can choose between A and B. But I think there are many things between that label. Difficult to explain, but like right now, I would have to think about that. But
Well, in a way, it also has to do with the intention of what we are studying as historians of education. Has our intention to do with revealing something that lies behind us, that lies within the period between 1940 and 1944? Or do we want to write histories that can show us something that happens now?
But to me, obviously I was trained as a historian, so I'm very interested in what happened in the past. So yes, it is my intention to know more about that, but I think it can also tell you something as to how we ended up here. So it also says something about the present, but it doesn't really, I think that your position is maybe you want to engage in future debates, maybe a bit more, whereas I want to engage in debates about the past and have that reveal something about where we are right now in the present. Maybe that's the difference. I'm not sure.
But so for you, history and the description of history is a means to explain who we have become.
Well, it doesn't. It's not the only.
It helps us
explanation,
understand.
but it helps us understand. Yeah, I think.
Okay, it helps us understand.
Yeah. It doesn't explain, but it helps understanding where we come from.
And
Helps explaining where we are now. I
Okay.
think. Yeah.
But it doesn't help us to change ourselves. Or
Um,
does it?
to change ourselves in what way? To learn something from the past, or?
Yeah, you could say to learn something. Or
I think obviously we do learn
To-
things about the past. I mean, I think especially in the context of the Second World War, I hope, at least I hope we learn something, considering the cruelties and all that. But the problem, I think, lies in that, in my view, history can never be a recipe for the future, because I mean, the history helps explaining the future, but it's not the same. I mean, it's not one line from the past to the future and over the present. I mean, how should I explain this? I think that because of the complexity of human life, I don't think that history can be a straightforward recipe for the future. Is that clear?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
That's completely.
I have difficulty sometimes with getting my thoughts out, but okay.
Yeah. But it's something that I'm struggling with too.
Yeah.
How
I
can
think
we
we all
write
do in a
histories
way.
in a way that we cease to construct them and see them as means to reconstruct something that lies behind us, but to see actually history as an educational tool, I would say.
Yeah. Deserves more thought.
Are there other questions? Just a very quick one from you, because I read your last statement. Schools, teachers, pupils, and parents were actors and were not mere victims. I don't know a lot about the two, so I asked my seatmate here to define, because you said that you were using the actor network theory as your conceptual toolbox.
Yeah.
So I asked Matthias, how does the tool define actor? And he said that first, an actor has an agency, and second, an actor is someone who creates, who makes a difference. And I asked him, does it always have to be in opposition of something? I mean, who makes a difference against, I don't know, an oppressor or an oppressive rule? And he said no, as long as he makes a difference. So being, and I thought about it. So being a victim and acting as a victim is also being an actor.
Being an actor. Yeah.
So
It's not an opposition.
It's not an opposition as you
that's
say.
actually the wrong choice of words.
Yeah,
I meant it a bit
but
differently.
how you phrased it seemed like being a victim.
Yeah, it's
Is not being
no,
an
that's
actor.
true. No, that's true. Yeah, that's not how I meant it.
Yeah, that's just my small confusion. Also, Matthias made it possible for me to be confused.
Thank you, Jenny and Matthias.
just the usage of the term. and how you know, seem to
oppose them. Although they're not. That's true.
yeah. So if there are other questions, no more.
No, just
Okay.
no, not a question, but in the last phrase, are you not more referring to the agency victimhood opposition than to the actor?
Yeah, agency. Yeah.
So I guess
I
the
do.
choice
Yeah,
of
it's
words.
just a question of rephrasing that.
So if there are no more questions, thank you, Sarah, for your presentation.